Chapter 8. 24th September. Julian Ashworth arrived on the afternoon ferry, and within 40 minutes of setting foot on the island, he had charmed the publican, befriended 3 fishermen, been offered tea by Mrs. Morag, and caused Old Cait to laugh so hard she spilled her whisky, which I am told has not happened since 1903. I watched all of this from a corner table in the Anchor, with Bram on my lap and a book I was not reading, and I thought, as I often do in Julian's company, that there is something fundamentally unfair about the distribution of social gifts in this world. But I am getting ahead of events. Let me record his arrival properly. The ferry came in at 2:30, earlier than expected, the sea having calmed overnight into a flat, sullen grey that the fishermen seemed to regard with suspicion, as though stillness were merely a ruse the ocean was trying out before its next assault. I had not gone to the harbour to meet him. I had not gone because I was busy with my manuscript, and because I did not want to give the impression that his arrival was an event I had noted on my calendar, which it was not, though I will concede that I had checked the ferry schedule twice that morning. I heard him before I saw him. Julian's voice carries, not loudly, but with a resonance like a cello or a church bell, something that makes other sounds flatten and recede around it. I was at my desk, writing up my notes on Seoris, and through the open window I heard a voice from the harbour that was unmistakably his, saying something to someone about the extraordinary beauty of the island and how it reminded him of a stretch of coast in Brittany where he had once nearly been killed by a tidal bore. And wasn't that marvelous? I put down my pen. I did not go to the window. This was a decision I made consciously, and which lasted approximately 8 seconds before I went to the window. Julian was on the harbour steps, surrounded by luggage. There was a great deal of luggage. I counted 4 trunks, 2 leather cases, a hat box, and what appeared to be a portable writing desk of the sort one sees in illustrations of gentlemen on safari. Behind him, looking variously amused and burdened, were his 2 research assistants, Margaret, Meg, a sturdy young woman with red hair cut unfashionably short and an expression of competent long-suffering, and Thomas, a tall, thin young man with spectacles and the permanently startled look of someone who has not yet adjusted to the fact that academic life involves leaving the library. Julian himself was exactly as I remembered him, and exactly as I always fail to prepare myself for. He is tall, several inches over 6 feet, and thin in a manner that suggests he does not eat enough, but carries it well, all angles and sharp edges. His hair is dark, nearly black, and falls across his forehead in a fashion that looks careless, and is almost certainly not. His face is the kind that people describe as striking, when they mean it is too sharp to be handsome in the usual sense. The cheekbones too defined, the jaw too narrow, the nose a fraction too long, but which is, in total, an arrangement that one finds difficult to stop looking at. His eyes are grey, not the dull grey of an overcast sky, but the clear, bright grey of water over stone, and they miss nothing, which is one of the many things about Julian Ashworth that I find unsettling. He was wearing, I noted from the window, a coat that had no business being on a Scottish island, dark wool, beautifully cut, entirely impractical, and he was smiling at Hamish, who had come down to the harbour and was standing with his arms crossed and his expression set to its default position of skeptical endurance. I went downstairs. Clara. He saw me the moment I appeared on the harbour steps. His face did something complicated, a rearrangement of features that moved through pleasure, warmth, and a flicker of something else that was gone before I could name it. And then he was smiling, that wide, easy smile that makes most people smile back and makes me want to check my pockets. "Ashworth," I said, "you're early." The sea was kind. I think it wanted to be rid of me. "How are you, my dear Clara? You look—" He paused, studying me with the frank assessment that he applies to everything, from manuscripts to architecture to the contents of other people's bookshelves. "You look like you've been crawling about in mud." "I have been crawling about in mud. It's called fieldwork." "So I've heard. Never tried it myself. I prefer my scholarship dry and preferably indoors." This was a lie. Julian has done extensive fieldwork in Brittany, Cornwall, and the Austrian Alps, and is perfectly capable of crawling in mud when the research requires it. But he enjoys the pose of the armchair scholar in the same way that some people enjoy wearing a costume, not because it fits, but because it amuses. "You have too much luggage," I said. "I have exactly the right amount of luggage." "You have too little. You always have too little. I imagine you brought 3 books and a change of stockings and considered it extravagant." I had, in fact, brought considerably more than that, but the accusation was near enough to the truth that I did not argue. Julian has an irritating talent for near truths, for observations that are not quite accurate, but not quite wrong either, and which lodge in one's mind like splinters. "Where are you staying?" I asked, though I already knew the answer because I have known Julian Ashworth for 6 years, and he has never in that time stayed anywhere that was not in my immediate proximity. "Well," he said, "I had thought your charming cottage might have a spare room." "It does not have a spare room. It barely has a room." "A floor, then. I'm not proud." This was also a lie. Julian Ashworth is one of the proudest people I have ever met, though he carries it so lightly you could mistake it for indifference. Or I could take lodgings at the Anchor, but the publican tells me the rooms above the bar have a damp problem and something living in the walls that he prefers not to discuss. I looked at Meg. Meg looked at me with the expression of a woman who has learned that being Julian Ashworth's research assistant involves a great deal of resignation. "He'll end up in your cottage regardless," she said. "It's less painful if you just agree now." Thomas, behind her, nodded silently. "And so Julian Ashworth is here, in my cottage, on my island, in the armchair by the fire that he commandeered within 15 minutes of arrival, and which he occupies with the air of a man who has always lived here and cannot imagine why anyone would suggest otherwise. Meg and Thomas have taken rooms at the Anchor, where they will contend with the damp and the unnamed wall creature, and where Meg has already established a working rapport with Dougal the publican based, I gather, on a shared appreciation of direct speech and strong drink. Julian, meanwhile, has installed himself in the cottage's downstairs room, having produced from one of his trunks a camp bed, a pillow, 2 blankets, a flask of brandy, and a small watercolor of what he claims is the coast of Finisterre. He hung the watercolor on the wall with a nail he borrowed from Hamish, without asking. Hamish watched this with the expression of a man who has already formed an opinion about Julian Ashworth and is not inclined to revise it. Bram, however, is delighted. This is unexpected, and I confess slightly wounding. Bram has spent the past 10 days treating me as somewhere between a servant and a minor inconvenience. But the moment Julian sat down in the armchair, Bram crossed the room, leapt into his lap, and began purring with a volume and enthusiasm he has never directed at me in 9 years of cohabitation. Julian scratched him behind the ears with the casual assurance of a man who expects all living creatures to adore him, and Bram responded by going boneless with pleasure and draping himself across Julian's knees like a ginger stole. "Your cat loves me," Julian said, looking up at me with an expression of insufferable satisfaction. "My cat is a traitor," I said. "Your cat has excellent taste." He looked down at Bram, who was purring hard enough to vibrate the armchair. "What have you been feeding him? He's enormous." "Tinned fish, mostly, and mice, which he catches himself. A self-sufficient beast, I approve." He settled deeper into the armchair, my armchair, which I had been using as a reading spot for 10 days, and which was now apparently his, and looked around the cottage with an appraising eye. "It's very austere. It's a fisherman's cottage on a Scottish island. What were you expecting?" "Nothing more, nothing less. I was merely observing." He looked at me. "You've been working. I can tell because your left hand is covered in ink, and you have that expression you get when you found something." I looked at my left hand. It was, indeed, covered in ink. I had not noticed. "I have found something," I said, and because it was Julian, and because he is the only person to whom I can say these things and know they will be understood, I told him. Not everything. Not about Seorus, not yet. I wanted to verify and document before I shared, but about the salt patterns, the chapel carvings, the Breton death markers. His expression changed as I spoke, the languid charm dropping away to reveal what lay underneath it. The sharp, focused attention of a very good mind at work. He leaned forward. Bram grumbled at the shift in position but held on. "Breton death markers," he said. "On Ara. 9 of them, carved into a stone that predates the chapel by centuries. Lefebvre's symbols, identical, except that the 7th, the crossing symbol, is inverted. I don't know what that means yet." Julian was quiet for a moment. This is itself noteworthy, because Julian is very rarely quiet. He fills silences instinctively, naturally, as though silence were a kind of vacuum that offends him. But when something genuinely interests him, when his mind snags on a problem like a sleeve catching on a nail, he goes still. His eyes unfocus slightly. He stops performing. "The inverted crossing," he said. "That's not in Lefebvre. That's not in anyone." "I know." "Clara." He looked at me, and for a moment the mask was entirely gone, and he was just Julian, without the charm, without the pose, and what was underneath was something more interesting than either. A man who cared about the same things I cared about, with the same ferocity, and who understood what an inverted crossing symbol might mean. This could be extraordinary. "It could," I said, "if the fieldwork supports it. Always the caveat." The mask slid back into place, smooth as glass. "You know, most scholars would be dancing on the table at this point." "I don't dance on tables. I document." "Yes," he said, "you do." And then, unexpectedly, "May I see the compendium?" I let him read it. This was not a small thing. I do not show the compendium to people as a matter of principle. It is unfinished, and showing unfinished work feels to me like appearing in public undressed, which is to say, it is theoretically survivable, but practically intolerable, is the only person who has read more than a chapter, and she is my sister, and even she was granted access, only because she sat on the manuscript and refused to move until I let her read the introduction. Ashworth has seen sections before, the chapter on Breton spectral traditions, which he critiqued with an infuriating combination of praise and nitpicking, and the introduction, which he called the best thing written in our field in 20 years, and then suggested I cut by a third. But he has never read the whole of it, and I have never offered. Tonight I offered. I don't entirely know why. Perhaps because I have been alone with it on this island for 10 days, and the weight of it, the years, the work, the sheer mass of accumulated knowledge and effort has begun to feel less like a project and more like a room I have been sitting in for too long. Perhaps because Julian is the only person alive who would read it properly. Perhaps because I was tired and it was late, and he was sitting in the armchair with Bram on his lap, and the firelight doing something complicated to the angles of his face, and I wanted someone else to hold the thing I had been carrying. I brought the portfolios downstairs and set them on the table. Julian looked at them, the battered leather, the bookbinder's tape, the faint greenish stain from the Kent poltergeist, and something crossed his face that I could not name. He opened the first portfolio and began to read. He read for 2 hours. I sat at my desk and pretended to work on my field notes while actually watching him from the corner of my eye, which is a thing I will admit in this journal and nowhere else. He read slowly, which surprised me. Julian does most things quickly, with an ease that makes effort look like an affectation of lesser minds. But he read the compendium slowly, turning each page with a care that I found, to my annoyance, moving. Occasionally, he made a sound, a small hum of agreement, or a sharp intake of breath at a passage that surprised him, or once a laugh, sudden and genuine, at a footnote I had written about the temperamental ghosts of a boarding house in Whitby. When he finished the last page of the first portfolio, he closed it and sat for a moment, with his hand resting on the cover. "Clara," he said, "this is very good." I waited for the qualification, the but, the suggestion to cut by a third, or restructure the index, or reconsider my position on directional symbolism. It did not come. "This is very good," he said again, and his voice was quiet, and he was not performing, and I did not know what to do with the feeling that rose in my chest. So I said, "Thank you," in a tone that was clipped and inadequate, and turned back to my field notes, and stared at them without seeing them for several minutes. It is very late now. Julian is asleep on the camp bed downstairs, or more accurately, he is lying on the camp bed with his eyes closed and his breathing steady, which is not the same thing. I have been watching him, which I acknowledge sounds peculiar, but I am a scientist, and he is a subject of study, whether he knows it or not. He lies very still, too still. A sleeping person shifts, turns, adjusts. Julian lies like something arranged, flat on his back, hands at his sides, not a wrinkle in the blanket, and his breathing is even, perfectly even, metronomic, in a fashion that human breathing in sleep simply is not. We breathe irregularly when we sleep. We sigh, we catch, we change rhythm. Julian does not. His chest rises and falls with the regularity of a clock, and I find myself counting the intervals. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out, and thinking, that is not sleep. That is a performance of sleep, executed by someone who has studied the mechanics but missed the essential quality, which is surrender. I also noticed, when he passed me a cup of tea this evening, that his fingers were cold. Not cool. Cold. The cold of a stone floor in winter, a cold that does not warm when you hold it. And I noticed that he positioned the camp bed as far from the fireplace tools as the room would allow. The poker, the tongs, the ash shovel, all iron. He did it casually, as though choosing the spot by the window for the light. But I saw his eyes flick to the iron and away, and I saw how he held his body as he passed them, contracted, careful, flinching from something invisible. I am now 96% certain, plus. But I will not ask, not yet, not until I know what he is doing here, on Ara, at the edge of the spectral world, with the grey walkers and the warden, and whatever it is that waits in the chapel of St. Bride. Julian Ashworth has come to this island for a reason, and it is not to help me with my compendium, however much he enjoys reading it. He is looking for something, and I intend to find out what. In the meantime, Bram has abandoned my bed and is sleeping on Julian's feet. I have raised him from a kitten, carried him across 11 countries, and nursed him through a fish-bone incident in Normandy that I do not wish to discuss. Julian has been here for 6 hours, but loyalty, it seems, is not among the feline virtues. I am going to bed. My pillow, for the first time in 10 days, is unoccupied, and I should be pleased about this. I am not entirely sure that I am. Notes. I have now observed Julian Ashworth in a state of apparent sleep on 14 separate occasions across 6 years of fieldwork together, and on not one of those occasions has he exhibited any of the standard indicators of genuine human sleep: irregular breathing, micro-movements, rapid eye movement, or the occasional involuntary vocalization. By contrast, I exhibit all of these with unfortunate vigor. I am told I talk in my sleep, a fact that Ashworth has never mentioned, but that I live in fear of, as my sleeping utterances are reportedly confined to complaints about footnote formatting and the occasional unflattering remark about Professor Fenton. The observant reader will note that my certainty has risen from 95%, as recorded in Chapter 2, to 96%, an increase of 1 percentage point. I acknowledge that this is not a dramatic shift. The additional point is attributable to the observation about the fireplace tools, which, while not conclusive, is consistent with the iron avoidance pattern I have been documenting. At the current rate of evidentiary accumulation, I expect to reach 98% by the end of the month, at which point I will need to decide whether to confront Julian directly or continue collecting data until I reach 100%, a state of certainty that, in thanatology as in life, may prove to be theoretical. Chapter 9. 25th September. Julian insisted on accompanying me to the moor this morning. I told him it was unnecessary. He told me it was raining. I said that it had been raining since I arrived on Ara, and that this was not, in my experience, a condition that responded to the presence of a second person. He said he had brought a larger umbrella. I said I did not require an umbrella. He pointed out that my coat was already wet and that I was shivering. I said I was not shivering. I was vibrating with scholarly intent. He came anyway. This is the essential difficulty with Julian Ashworth. He does not argue. He does not insist. He simply does what he has decided to do, and does it with such an air of casual inevitability that one finds oneself going along with it before one has properly formulated an objection. It is, I suspect, his most dangerous quality, more dangerous than his charm, which at least has the decency to announce itself. Julian's stubbornness disguises itself as accommodation, which is really a very underhanded thing. We set out at 4:30, which is the hour at which Seorus has most reliably appeared in the past. The rain had softened to a drizzle that was, if anything, more miserable than a proper downpour, the sort that does not so much fall as hang in the air, coating everything in a fine damp that finds its way beneath collars and up sleeves, and into the very marrow of one's resolve. Julian walked beside me in a coat that was far too fine for the moor, and boots that were, irritatingly, better suited to the terrain than mine. He had his hands in his pockets, and his collar turned up, and looked, as he always does, as though he had been placed in the landscape by an oil painter concerned with composition. I looked, as I always do, like a rain-dampened academic who had lost her left boot in a bog-hole the previous week and not entirely forgiven it. We reached the Standing Stones at 4:45. The sky was low, the mist thick across the lower moor, and the stones stood up out of it like broken teeth. I set out my offering, salt and heather in the standard northern pattern, and settled myself on the flattest stone to wait, my field journal open on my knees, my pencil already damp. Julian leaned against the watcher stone with his arms folded, and was, for once, quiet. We waited. At 5:30, the temperature dropped. I noted this, 3 degrees in 4 minutes by the small thermometer I carry, and the mist thickened to something closer to fog. Julian straightened. His eyes, I noticed, had gone to the salt ring before I said anything. He felt it too, the shift in the air, how the silence changed quality. Seorus appeared at the northern gap in the salt ring, as he had the previous 3 times. He came gradually, like a photograph developing. First the outline, a smudge of pale gray against the darker gray of the mist, then the features, the thin face, the old-fashioned clothes, the translucent hands that moved in small, restless gestures, as though he were fidgeting with something invisible. "Good evening," I said, in Scots Gaelic, which is the language in which Seorus is most comfortable. He looked at me, then he looked at Julian. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Seorus, who on our previous meetings had been curious and playful, drifting around my offerings with the air of a dinner guest, examining the appetizers, asking me questions about Edinburgh and my cat and the peculiar device I used to measure temperature, went rigid, not frightened exactly, alert, the way a deer goes alert when it hears a sound it cannot yet place. His translucent features sharpened, and he drew back half a step, and the restless movements of his hands stopped. "You brought something," he said to me, in Gaelic. His eyes had not left Julian. "Something cold." "This is my colleague," I said. "Dr. Ashworth. He is also a thanatologist." "He is not a thanatologist," Seorus said. This was delivered with a flatness that brooked no argument. "He is something else." Julian, who does not speak Gaelic, was watching this exchange with an expression of polite interest that did not quite conceal the tension in his jaw. "What is he saying?" he asked me. "He's remarking on the weather," I said. "Give me a moment." I turned back to Seorus, but he was already fading, pulling back into the mist with a rapidity I had not seen from him before. His form lost definition, the edges blurring, the face becoming a pale oval, and then a smear, and then nothing. "Wait," I said, but he was gone. I stood in the salt ring for several minutes, hoping he might return. He did not. The temperature rose, the mist thinned. The moor was just a moor again, wet, cold, and empty of everything except Heather and Julian Ashworth, who was looking at me with one eyebrow raised. "The weather," he said. "He was startled by you," I said, because there was no point in dissembling entirely. I've never seen him react to another person's presence. He's been entirely indifferent to my descriptions of other people. But he noticed you. I have that effect on spectres and dinner party guests alike. Julian. Clara. I looked at him. He looked at me. The rain had plastered his dark hair against his forehead, and the fading light had leached the color from his eyes, turning them from gray to something closer to silver. And for a moment, he looked less like a man standing on a moor, and more like something the moor had produced, pale, sharp-edged, belonging to the landscape in a way that living people generally do not. "He called you something cold," I said. Julian's expression did not change. How unflattering. It wasn't a figure of speech. He meant it literally. Seorus perceives living people as warm. He's told me as much. He perceived you as cold. I am cold. It's raining, and you refused the umbrella. I let this pass, though I recorded it in my field journal later that evening. Julian's deflections, I have learned, are their own kind of data. A man who answers a direct question with a joke is a man who has heard the question very clearly and would prefer that you hadn't asked it. We argued on the walk back. This is not unusual. Julian and I argue the way most people breathe, which is to say frequently, reflexively, and with varying degrees of awareness. But this particular argument had an edge that was not pleasant. It began with methodology. Julian suggested, in his languid way, that my approach to the Grey Walkers was too systematic. "Too systematic," I said. "You're treating them like specimens, setting out salt in measured rings, recording temperatures, timing appearances. It's very thorough, and it's entirely wrong. I am conducting fieldwork. Fieldwork requires method. Fieldwork requires presence. These are not microbes under a lens, Clara. They're beings. They respond to intention, to emotion, to the quality of your attention. You can't measure your way into their confidence." "And what would you suggest? That I sit on the moor and feel at them?" "I would suggest that you put down the thermometer and actually listen. I'm aware that this is a criticism that has been leveled at my work before, and I am equally aware that there is a grain of sense in it, buried beneath the irritating presentation. But I was cold and wet and annoyed about Seorus's disappearance, and so I said something about the difference between scholars who collect evidence and scholars who collect anecdotes, and Julian said something about the difference between scholars who finish their books and scholars who spend 8 years not finishing them. And by the time we reached the cottage, we were not speaking. I went upstairs. He stayed downstairs. Bram, with the unerring instinct of a creature that always chooses the winning side, remained with Julian. I should record, while the subject is present, the matter of the Edinburgh chair, because it is the engine that drives this entire enterprise, and because Julian's careless remark about my book being unfinished landed in a place that was already sore. Here are the facts. The University of Edinburgh will, in March of next year, appoint a new professor of thanatological studies, the Moray chair, endowed in 1843, one of only 4 tenured positions in thanatology in Britain. I have been an adjunct lecturer at Edinburgh for 5 years, which means that I do the work of a professor for the pay and status of an afterthought. The Moray chair would change this. It would mean a salary, a permanent office, students, a laboratory, access to the university's spectral archives. In short, it would mean that my life's work was recognized as actual work, and not the eccentric hobby of a woman too peculiar for polite employment. I am the leading candidate. My publication record is extensive, my fieldwork unmatched, and the compendium, when it is finished, will be the definitive text in the field. My only competition is Professor Aldous Fenton, who has connections, a family name, a Y chromosome, and a monograph on Highland wraiths that is adequate as a meal of boiled cabbage is adequate. It satisfies the minimum requirements of the form, while offering neither nourishment nor delight. Fenton will be appointed if my compendium is not finished by January. This is not speculation. It is the quiet understanding that has been conveyed to me through the reliable medium of departmental gossip. The committee wants the book. Without it, I am merely promising. With it, I am undeniable. Julian knows all of this. Julian, who has a permanent position at Oxford that he appears to have obtained by some combination of brilliance, connections, and the kind of effortless confidence that institutions find irresistible, is not in the habit of taking academic politics seriously. Fenton is a bore, he said to me once. Surely that alone disqualifies him. When I pointed out that the Academy is not, in fact, a meritocracy, that boredom and mediocrity are not barriers to advancement, but are, in many cases, qualifications for it, he waved his hand and said something about how I was the best in the field, and the committee would see that, and everything would sort itself out. Everything does not sort itself out. Not for people like me. Things sort themselves out for people like Julian, people who move through the world as though it were arranged for their convenience, who open doors by smiling at them, who have never had to prove that they belong in a room because the room was built for them. I am aware that this is not entirely fair to Julian, who has his own difficulties, some of which I am beginning to suspect are considerably more serious than the question of a university chair. But it was how I felt this evening, sitting at my desk with damp socks and an empty moor behind me, and a spectre who had vanished at the sight of my colleague. And I will record it honestly, because that is what journals are for. Moira brought porridge this morning. It was, once again, terrible, a gray, lumpen mass that clung to the spoon with the tenacity of something that did not wish to be eaten. I thanked her warmly because she is kind, and ate 2 bites because I am polite, and fed the rest to Bram, who is neither kind nor polite, but who has an iron constitution and no aesthetic standards whatsoever when it comes to food. Julian, to my irritation, ate his entire portion. Whether this reflects genuine appetite, a superior capacity for diplomatic falsehood, or the fact that he does not actually need to eat and therefore has no real investment in the flavor of what passes through him, I cannot say. But Moira beamed at him, and he beamed back, and I sat in the corner with Bram and my cold tea and felt like a gargoyle. Chapter 10. 27th September. I went to see Old Cait today, and she told me a story, and I am going to record it here in full, because it is the most important piece of oral testimony I have collected on Ara, and because I have a crawling feeling at the back of my neck that has not gone away since I heard it. Cait Mackinnon lives in a cottage at the far end of Dunmore, past the kirk and up a muddy track that is more suggestion than road. Her home is small and dark, and smells of peat smoke and whisky and a dry herbal scent I cannot identify. She was sitting by the fire when I arrived, a glass of whisky in her hand, at 10 in the morning, which I mention not in judgment, but in admiration, and she looked at me with eyes that were sharp and dark and younger than the rest of her face by several decades. "Sit down," she said. "You'll be wanting the story of the warden." I had not told her I was coming, nor what I wanted to discuss. I had mentioned the warden to precisely 2 people on the island, Hamish, who had not responded, and Moira, who had changed the subject. Old Cait, it appeared, had her own sources of information. I sat. She poured me a whisky without asking. I do not generally drink before noon, but there are contexts in which refusal would be rude, and this was one of them. The whisky was extraordinarily good, peaty, smoky, with a warmth that spread from the throat downward like slow fire. I told her so. "My son makes it," she said. "Don't tell the excise man." I assured her that I was not acquainted with the excise man and had no intention of becoming so. She nodded, satisfied, and settled herself in her chair and began. "The warden," she said, "was a man once. This was a long time ago, before the Kirks, before the English, before the Norse. He had a name then, but we don't use it. You don't use the real names of things that are listening." She took a drink. The fire popped. Rain struck the window in irregular bursts, like something tapping to come in. He was a chieftain of this island, a young man, strong, well-liked. He had a wife and 2 sons, and a hall on the cliffs where the ruin of St. Bride's stands now. His people fished and farmed and lived as people do. They were born, and they died, and the dead went where the dead go, and the living carried on. Then the plague came. She said this with the matter-of-factness of someone describing weather. I have noticed this quality in the best storytellers. The worst parts are delivered flat, because the horror speaks for itself and does not need embellishment. Not a plague like you'd know, not the Black Death, not smallpox. This was a sickness of the boundary. The wall between the living and the dead grew thin. The dead began to walk, not the grey walkers as we know them. This was before that. These were the raw dead, the new dead, the ones who hadn't learned to be dead yet. They came back, confused and hungry, and they spread their confusion like a fever. People fell into trances. They stopped eating, stopped speaking. They walked into the sea or up onto the moor and didn't come back. The boundary was leaking, and the living were draining through it. I was writing as fast as I could. Cait watched me scribble and seemed neither pleased nor displeased by it. She had the air of someone reciting something that existed independently of her and would go on existing whether I wrote it down or not. The chieftain went to the boundary, the place where it was thinnest, the stones, the same stones you've been sitting at, and he called out to whatever was on the other side. He said, "Take me instead, seal the wall, stop the leaking, use my life to patch the hole." And something answered. She drank. I waited. The fire had burned low, and the room was very dark, and Cait's face in the last of the firelight was all hollows and angles, the bones close beneath the skin. The thing that answered wasn't death. It wasn't alive either. It was the threshold itself, the boundary, the wall, the place between. It had no mind, no will. Not exactly, but it had a need. The hole had to be mended, and a life was being offered, and it took what was offered, It took his mortality. It took his name. It took his son's memory of his face and his wife's memory of his voice and every trace that he had been a man, and in their place it put him, the warden, the keeper, the one who stands at the door. He sealed the boundary. He became the boundary. He is the wall between the living and the dead on this island. He holds it. He maintains it. He keeps the dead on their side and the living on theirs. And in exchange, he is neither. He is the door and the lock and the key. And the grey walkers? I asked. His court. Cait's voice was dry. The ones who stay close to the wall. Some are old dead, some are new. Some chose to stay. Some were kept. The warden needs company, or whatever it is that the warden feels instead of need. They walk the boundary, and they keep it sound, and they serve him, and he serves the wall. I finished writing. My hand was cramped, and my whisky was empty, and the story sat in my chest like a stone. It was, I recognized, a variant of a motif I had encountered in Breton, Welsh, and Cornish folklore, the sacrificial guardian, the mortal who trades humanity for a role in the spectral architecture. But the Ara version was different in a way I could not yet articulate, rawer, less polished, as though it had not been shaped by retelling as most folk tales are, as though it had been told precisely this way, in these words, since the beginning. You said the wall needs mending, I said. Does it still need mending? Is the warden still maintaining it? Cait looked at me. Her eyes in the firelight were black. The warden does his work, she said, but a wall needs mortar. The old mortar wears thin. He needs new mortar. What kind of mortar? People. She said it simply. People who can walk the threshold. People who can see both sides. People like you, Dr. Lennox. I opened my mouth and found I had nothing to say. This is unusual for me. He collects things, Cait said. The warden, people, stories, time. He'll want to collect you. He may have started already. I appreciate the warning, I said, which was both true and inadequate. She snorted. Warning. I'm telling you what is. What you do with it is your own business. She refilled my glass. You'll notice I'm not telling you to leave. No. That's because it wouldn't do any good. You're a scholar. Telling a scholar to stop looking is like telling the sea to stop being wet. You just do it more stubbornly and with worse planning. She raised her glass. So, here's to good planning, Dr. Lennox. You'll be needing it. We drank. She refilled my glass a second time, and I drank that too. And somewhere during the second glass, she told me about her own experience with the Grey Walkers, not the warden himself, but the common dead who walk the boundary. She had seen them first as a girl of 9, standing on the moor at dusk, watching the lights. She had thought they were lanterns. Her grandmother, who had the sight, told her what they really were. I'm no threshold walker, she said, as though anticipating my question. I can see them a bit when the light is right and I've had enough whiskey. But I can't cross over. Never could. My grandmother now. She could see clear through to the other side. She said it was like looking through a window with dirty glass. You could make out shapes, but not details. Cait paused. She said the warden looked at her sometimes, through the glass, and that his face was always changing, like he'd forgotten which one was his. This detail, The shifting face, the lost identity, aligns with the central element of the sacrifice narrative. If the warden traded his name and his humanity for guardianship, then the instability of his appearance is not a choice but a consequence. He is, in a sense, the opposite of a ghost. Where a ghost retains identity and loses substance, the warden retains substance and loses identity. This inversion is compelling, and I intend to discuss it at length in the Compendium. I left Cait's cottage at noon, considerably more affected by the whisky than I wished to be, and walked back through the rain with the story turning over and over in my mind like a stone in a stream, wearing itself smooth and finding its shape. Julian was at the cottage when I returned, sitting at the kitchen table with Bram on his lap, reading a copy of Polwheel's Traditions of the Cornish Dead that he claimed to have brought for reference. The title caught my eye, so did how he held it, tightly with both hands, as though it were an anchor rather than a book. He was reading the chapter on Grey Lords. "Good afternoon," I said. "I've been to see Old Cait." "I know. Moira told me. She also told me Cait's whisky could strip paint." "It was very good whisky." "You're weaving." "I am not weaving. I am processing complex ethnographic data." I sat down, rather more heavily than intended. "She told me about the warden." Julian set down his book. His expression, I noticed, had lost its habitual lightness. "Tell me," he said. And so I did, the whole of it, the chieftain and the plague and the bargain and the wall. I told it less well than Cait had, because I was somewhat drunk, and because Cait has the storyteller's gift that I lack, the ability to let silence do the work. But I told it, and Julian listened, and when I was finished he sat for a long time without speaking. "A living seal," he said at last. "Yes." He traded his mortality to become the boundary itself. That's what the story says. It's not just a story, Clara. His voice was low and very even. You know that. I did know that. The distinction between story and fact in thanatology is not the clean line that the public imagines. Stories are how the truth survives in places where no one writes things down. They are compressed, stylized, distorted by repetition. But the core of them, the mechanism, is often more accurate than any scholarly account, because the people who told them had lived alongside the phenomena and did not have the luxury of abstraction. "I know," I said. He picked up his book again. "Be careful," he said, and how he said it, not carelessly, not as a pleasantry, but with the weight of something carried a long distance, made me look at him, but his face was hidden behind Polwheel, and Bram was purring, and the moment passed. I have spent the evening cross-referencing Cait's account with the relevant scholarship, and the following emerges. The sacrificial guardian motif appears in 6 distinct traditions across Western Europe. In Brittany, the Anku, the spirit who collects the dead, is said to be the last person to die in each parish each year, condemned to serve as collector until replaced. In Wales, the Cybon and Dubian are sometimes described as mortal huntsmen transformed by their bargain with the other world. In Cornwall, and here I pause, because the Cornish tradition is the one I know least well, and the one that now seems most relevant, the Grey Lords of the coastal thresholds are described in Polwheel's Traditions of the Cornish Dead, 1847, as former mortals who traded their lives to seal the boundaries between the living world and the courts of the dead. Julian's Cornish connection, Julian's fieldwork in Cornwall, Julian's drowning. I keep coming back to this. I do not have enough evidence to draw conclusions, and I will not speculate in writing, because speculation in writing has a way of hardening into certainty that one did not intend. But the parallels are there, and they are not comfortable. Somewhere outside, the wind has shifted, and I can hear the sea more clearly than usual. A low, rhythmic thing, almost musical. I have closed the window. Notes. The sacrificial guardian motif is classified as Thompson Motif Index S261 Foundation Sacrifice, with elements of E501, The Wild Hunt, and F81, Descent to the Lower World. I have argued elsewhere, Lennox, on the persistence of threshold guardians in North Atlantic traditions. Edinburgh Review of Thanatology, Volume 14, 1909, that these motifs should be reclassified as a distinct category, which I have termed boundary servitude narratives, on the grounds that the existing categories fail to account for the specific mechanism of exchange, mortality for guardianship, that distinguishes them from ordinary foundation sacrifices. The Unku tradition varies significantly by region. In the Finisterre variant, the Unku retains memory of his mortal life and is driven to sorrow by his duties. In the Morbihan variant, all mortal memory is erased. The Ara tradition, as told by Cait, falls between these poles. The warden's mortal identity is lost, but the echo of it persists in his behavior, his attachment to the island, his need for company. This intermediate position is, to my knowledge, unique, and I intend to discuss it at length in the Compendium. The motif of the voluntary sacrifice, the chieftain who offers himself to seal the boundary, appears in multiple Celtic traditions, but is most extensively documented in the Ara oral tradition, of which Cait Mackinnon's account is the fullest version I have collected. Compare with Alderman's Spectral Architectures, 1889, pages 234 to 251, in which the concept of the living seal is discussed at length. Though Alderman's analysis is hampered by his insistence on treating all spectral phenomena as manifestations of collective hysteria, a position that has not aged well.